we've been, of course, reading Brueggemann's prophetic imagination, and as I was talking with uh, Denny and Mac early on, and Al, it's really interesting for me, at least, to read this in the midst of what appear to be some changes that are happening in our country with the last election. Because there is at least some energizing that's taking place. And remember what Brueggemann says, this energizing is always built around some sort of story of promise. The cry is heard, uh, and people realize, things are not as they should be. And then the prophet is one who helps them to both criticize and then energize uh, into a new vision. And I can't help but think that the response that people have had over uh, last month or so to the goings on in Washington and other places around the world uh, hasn't been the result of some sort of criticism and energizing, not from necessarily from Christian prophets, but they've been part of the equation. But there's also kind of a national spirit and a national sense. When we left off last time, I gave a very brief introduction to how the assumption that Brueggemann has when he's reading the Hebrew Bible. And I think he is assuming his readers probably understand his paradigm and his methodology as well. But it's to the everyday reader, like as we tend to be, it's really important to remember that biblical scholarship in the Old Testament for the last, well, it's been over 140 years now, has focused on what's known as the Wellhausen hypothesis. And it is the idea that, when you look at the Pentateuch and the historical books, it's especially the Pentateuch, it's often been assumed that these books were written by Moses, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? Because Moses probably didn't have pen and paper in the middle of the desert. He never made it into the promised land. But Wellhausen, Julius Wellhausen, was a German scholar and did a close reading of the Hebrew Bible. And he noticed that very early on, if you read the book of Genesis, you will see that there are places where God is referred to by his holy name, Yahweh, but there are other places where God is referred to as Elohim. And what this suggested to Wellhausen, and of course there are strands of literature where the name is used in both places, is that the Pentateuch was written over a long period of time, beginning in 922 BCE, and then ending in its final edited version around 400 BCE. So over 500 years of time. Now remember what's happening in that 500 years of time. In 922 BCE, Solomon is king. Actually, he dies in that year. The 12 tribes of Israel split into two groups, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And you have a number of prophets who speak to either one of those and sometimes to both. Amos, as we'll be looking at in our adult ed forum on Sunday, spoke to the northern tribes of Israel. But let's just stay on that 100-year period of time. This division of the people of God, the covenant community, into two groups also is represented by a division in the stories that they told. It is the group in the south, the Yahwists, the people who are the people of Judah, who are going to write a narrative that focuses on God's promise to Abraham and Abraham's son Isaac, and of course is going to culminate in the promise of David as the anointed king. And this is what is going to be referred to eventually as the monarchical tradition. The people in the north, however, in Israel, they write a narrative that is very heavily focused on the Egyptian experience, the experience of being drawn out of Egypt by, the power of God, wandering in the desert. They receive the covenant, and they are uh, given a new sense of identity. And it's that covenant that constitutes who they are as a people. Then thus, the covenant becomes their constitution. And we know that from about 1200 to about 1000, a 200-year period of time, the 12 tribes of Israel, this include Naphtali and Manasseh and Judah and Simeon and all those 12 names that we know so well, are uh, settled in the land, and they're confederated by their faithfulness to God. Probably the passage from Joshua that talks about choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Well, every year, all of the tribes would come together at Shechem and they would renew the covenant, very much like renewing, marriage vows, right? It's when David becomes king that those 12 tribes get upset and David starts to consolidate all things in Jerusalem. He, has his palace there. His son Solomon is going to build a temple there. There's going to be a whole temple complex of our cultic complex of priests who are going to be focused on the daily worship of God and sacrifices. But most importantly, the Ark of the Covenant is going to be taken from the people and placed in the temple itself. And now, with the coming of David, there's going to be the need for mediators, right? The people can no longer be in the presence of God, in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, as they were presumably in the desert when they wandered, as they were as 12 tribes. So there are some bookends here, you might say, that Brueggemann is talking about. The story that is going to support the people of Judah is going to be a group of tales that are collected under what scholars call the Yahwist tradition. The story that is going to support the people of the North is going to be under a group of tales that constitute what's called the Elohist tradition. God is referred to as Elohim in this tradition. Now, much later on, I'll just say this very briefly. Much later on, in 620, a history is going to be written called the Deuteronomistic History, and it's going to be added to the mix. And then at or about or shortly after the Babylonian captivity in 586 to 539 BCE, a new tradition called the priestly tradition is going to be added to the mix. And these four traditions are all going to be collected by an editor in around 400 BCE, and it's going to come to be known as the Pentateuch and the historical books. And I showed you this image last time, and I hope it's helpful. But if you were, we don't include Deuteronomy in this color graph because Deuteronomy is basically written by the Deuteronomist and does not contain a significant amount of strands from the Yahwist or the Elohist tradition. But if you look at the Genesis tradition, you will see if you were to color code each of the chapters, so to speak, or the verses, it would come out looking like this. You will see a lot of the Yahwist tradition is present in Genesis. Now, of course, you see some overlap. You see the Elohist tradition from the north is also present in Genesis. What we find is that the stories about Jacob and Esau and that tradition seems to have been focused on in the north. Okay, and then when you get to the Exodus story, you will see that there's not a whole lot of the Yahwist tradition that's in the Exodus story. You see a lot of the, excuse me, you see a lot of the priestly tradition, of course, which is blue, and you see a lot of the Elohist tradition. So what I'm trying to intimate here is that these two traditions are going to inform the identity of Israel throughout the Old Testament period. One of those is going to be a very monarchical tradition that focuses on God choosing a king, and we see that in the Yahwist narrative. The other is going to be on a much more egalitarian, less hierarchical tradition, which focuses on the covenant community and the importance of justice and righteousness in that community. Now, as we head into the Advent season, I want to emphasize here, and by the way, Karen, you were in the Sunday school class on Sunday, and I'm repeating some of the things that I said there. I'm teaching a class on the prophets all through Advent, and I gave an introduction to that last Sunday. But when we look at the gospel story, and we look especially at the narrative, the birth narratives we find in Matthew and we find in Luke, we see one of those narratives as representative of the monarchical tradition. That is that Jesus is a king anointed by God who is, to whom is brought all of these kingly gifts, the wise men from the east, who is a threat, to the powers that be, to King Herod. This is very consistent with the Yahwist tradition, the oldest tradition that we have in the Pentateuch. But if you look at the Luke story, the story of Jesus, the lowly servant born in a manger with shepherds who come to worship him, that is right out of the Northern Elohist tradition. Neither one of these, at least in Christian theology or in the way that the church reads these, neither one of these stories should cancel out the other. They have both been incorporated. I think at Christmas time, we tend to focus on, the star and the wise men and the idea that a king is born. This is God with us. But at the same time, we've got this other, very lowly story of the child born in a manger. We're seeing Brueggemann in this book talk about the history that produces these two traditions. On one end of that history is the experience of the people in Egypt, this liberating experience in Egypt and coming to Mount Sinai, receiving the covenant, and understanding that the Ten Commandments are going to be their constitution for helping them to pursue justice, righteousness, and compassion. It's a very egalitarian understanding of the people. At the other end, we have a tradition in which Solomon builds a temple. God is placed in that temple, and it's a very magisterial type tradition, right? Where a certain king is chosen from a certain community, and it really, as Brueggemann's going to point out, it reestablishes the very triumphalism that the people were trying to remove themselves from in Egypt. But nevertheless, it's part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I'm sorry if I'm going over that, but this Wellhausen hypothesis and the strands of literature that we find in the Pentateuch are varied. There's not one monolithic strand of literature. What Christianity eventually does is it incorporates both of those strands, the Yahwist and Elohist, into an understanding of Jesus as prophet, priest, and king. The three biggies, kind of a Trinitarian understanding of the work of Christ. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions about that. Or if I hope I haven't completely just befuddled you, because this has become old hat for me. But I'll tell you, when I was in seminary, I learned this. It took me years to just get a good handle on what it was that was happening in the Pentateuch. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Dan, I think it's interesting, and your graph here bears this out, which must be confounding to that fairly still substantial portion of people who believe that the Pentateuch was basically a chronological memoir
Right.
of Moses.
Right.
But the Genesis starts off with the P material,
Right.
which is the oldest in the tradition.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it shifts and it doesn't say, oh, by the way, we're shifting.
Right.
But, for my, God's now almost 55-year-old notes here, then after,
Really?
Genesis 2 verses 3, it switches. And if you're at all a critical
Right.
reader, you can
Right.
tell there's a whole shift in tone, and
Right.
it goes into J material, and that
Correct.
goes on for a couple of more chapters until it switches back to the priestly. So the editors
Right.
had something in mind other than trying to fob this off as a memoir.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, they had four traditions in mind, and they didn't want to throw one out because they affirmed that each of those, all of those traditions were divinely inspired or held some place of honor in the tradition. But yes, it doesn't take much to read Genesis chapter 1 and then Genesis chapter 2 and see that the stories don't match up. In Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve are created on the final day of creation before the Sabbath. In Genesis chapter 2, Adam and Eve are created on the first day. you know God is in the garden, and he makes a garden and he creates Adam and Eve, and then he creates animals, right, and says, I'm going to bring these to Adam and Eve. And the whole thing, if we read it with our critical mind that we can't help but read it with, after the Enlightenment, we just say this doesn't make sense. Tell me what the order of creation is. Well, Genesis 1 says one thing, Genesis 2 says the other.
Yeah,
But
that's exactly right. That when you're talking to a creationist and they say, "Well, I believe in the creation theory of life," uh, as in the Bible, the next question should be, "Well, which one?"
right, right. And Genesis 2 says that Adam was created from, or Eve was created from the rib of Adam when he didn't find any animals that were, to his specifications. Genesis 1 basically says that the human beings are created male and female together. So I mean, the implications of that are interesting as well. And you really touched on something that has occupied my mind for many years. So I'm just going to say this one thing. The priestly tradition was meant to be a kind of doxology. We're going to talk about doxology in the prophetic when we talk about the prophetic imagination, but it is an affirmation of God's grandeur. It is uh, it's written in a liturgical style that was meant to be recited or sung in the Sabbath worship service. You can read through it, and it's got a kind of meter in the Hebrew, and it's got, these recurring, and God said, and then God rested, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, let there be this. And then God saw that it was good. Uh, this was written during the Babylonian captivity when Jews were trying to keep their children from being assimilated into the Babylonian culture. So it was a song that would affirm their understanding of how God created the world. Um, but I don't, this is we're kind of hopping down a bunny trail that we don't need to at this time. Uh, but reading the Old Testament with this Wellhausen hypothesis in mind really helps to explain a lot of things. For example, there seem to be redundancies in the story about Abraham and, for example, Hagar. There are two Abraham and Hagar stories. There are, duplications of stories that were present in the Northern Kingdom as well as in the Southern Kingdom. And the editor said, well, let's just put them both in there. They didn't, it wasn't about being entirely consistent or not redundant, right? Um, any other thoughts about this?
Dan,
Yeah.
following the kingship of Solomon's son, when did the notion of kings begin to fade, you know, among the Israelites?
Well, unfortunately, they didn't until they were basically wiped out. Let me just say very briefly, the Northern Kingdom, the 10 tribes in the Northern Kingdom, it did not take long before they established a king for themselves, right? And then you have the small group of Levitical priests who are saying, no, 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 you're getting it wrong. The king is the problem, right? But the Northern Kingdom, they're in the midst of these city states who had kings, who had standing armies, and all of those things. It became such a you know, a part of the status quo that it wasn't long before Samaria became the seat of the north and then Judah in the south. But this is what the prophets were trying to do. Some prophets were saying it's okay to be a king, but you have to be a righteous and just king, right? And so you'll see people like Isaiah who tries to uphold the kingly monarchical tradition, but has an idealized view of what that king is supposed to look like. Then you have people like Amos, who we're going to see, who is going to rail against the northern kings by pointing out all of their injustices and their failure to be part of a representative of the covenant community. But kingship really dies out for the most part after the Babylonian captivity, when the kings are just basically, if they're kings at all, there was a king, Zerubbabel was the first king of the return to Jerusalem, but he was basically just a puppet of the Persians. And then, of course, when the Greeks come in, there's no possibility that they're going to be any kinds of kings at all. So that's a brief history. Will, did you say? Go ahead, Denny.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That really helps.
Yeah. Okay. Will, did you say you wanted to say something? Okay, good. Great. All right. Well, that is a review of our Wellhausen hypothesis. Brueggemann is going to say that a prophet must do two things simultaneously. And I would say in order. First, they must critique the powers that be. Prophets both criticize and energize. And he early on in the chapter, or actually I think it was in the preface, he says, the left and the right, or the conservatives and the progressives, have never held these two in a creative tension in a way. The conservatives, and when he was writing, this would have been the evangelicals of the Jerry Falwell ilk. The conservatives always looked at the idea of energizing people with this idea that Christ was going to return soon, and that God has a great plan for our nation, or God has a great plan for the church, but failed to criticize the power structures that were not representative of the covenant ideals. By contrast, the progressives, as I think Brueggemann refers to them, and these would have been the people who were producing the liberation theology at the time, and were starting to take a social scientific view of how it is that the structures of society were oppressive inherently, systemically. They're really good at criticizing, but they don't offer any kind of energizing hope or message. Now, I frankly think he's a little bit harsh on the progressives, because I think the liberation theologians did offer a message of hope. But he is right in that their Marxist methodology of criticizing the oppressive systemic structures of capitalism, of the American political structure, all of those things, and imperialism, did not carry with them an energizing message. So what must happen is that a prophet must bring these two things together, and they're the two sides of one coin. And Brueggemann makes a very interesting point that I think that the liberation theologians would agree with it as well, is that prophetic criticism begins with the experience of grieving. And this word in the Hebrew word, za'ak, really is a grieving that's a crying out. You know, you think of the mother tearing her clothes, and the man in sackcloth and ash, you know, lamenting the death of a child, for example, that kind of grieving. But it's also the word that's used for bringing a case, in a court system against, uh, a defendant. In this case, the people of Israel, the Hebrews. I'm going to use the correct term here. The Hebrews, the dusty ones, as they're referred to, are crying out to their, well, first of all, they're just crying out because of their experience of oppression. And in that grieving, that crying out, Moses makes it very apparent that they will be heard because God is the one who's taken the initiative in this. God calls Moses to go to the people and say, I'm the God of your fathers, and I'm the God of, your ancestors. Come into the desert and kind of get to know me again. Come and worship me. And Brueggemann makes a really interesting point on this, and he doesn't expand on it enough, at least for my thinking. And maybe you can offer your thoughts on this, but think about the Hebrew people making bricks with, very little straw, and being in the midst of oppression. We might even say chains, or for the most part, think about African Americans. I mean, this story was so important to them in the antebellum South, right? But grieving in the context of the Hebrews gives rise to history because it is the faithful assumption that the grief is going to be heard by God, and God will respond. The reason that this is the beginning of history is if you think about, I talked about this a little bit last time, but if you think about the two types of gods, in the Egyptian system, the gods were basically the guarantors of order, that the Nile would always, flood at this time, and that agriculture would proceed as usual, and that anything new was a threat to that order. So unlike, our society today, where we were always looking for new and improved, right? You didn't want new and improved in Egypt because that meant that the status quo and the order of things was going to be disrupted. But the God of the Israelites is a God who does not maintain a distance from the world, but becomes active in the concrete daily existence that includes time and space and people, and is going to try to make, or I shouldn't say try to make, is going to make their experience different, is going to try to introduce something new into time and space. And history itself is the record of the introduction of newness into time and space. This idea of the eternal breaking into the temporal will automatically create something that is novel and unique. So that's what I think Brueggemann has in mind here, that the God of the Israelites is a God of history, unlike the gods of the Canaanites. This God was a God who worked in time and space, whose spirit was present in time and space, and was one with the people. This is going to be, to reach its most perfect form, of course, in Christian theology, in the incarnation, that God becomes literally one with a human body, that God and humanity become one in the incarnation of Christ. So this is the first step in prophetic criticism, is that grieving reaches out to God with the hope that something new will happen. And so I've got Brueggemann's quote here on page 13. Prophetic criticism consists in mobilizing people to their restless grief and in nurturing them away from cry hearers who are inept at listening and indifferent in response. Surely history consists of speaking and being answered, crying and being heard. If that is true, it means that there can be no history in the empire because the cries are never heard and the speaking is never answered. You know, to hear the cries means that you would respond and thus introduce something new, into the status quo. This is what God is able to do with the people, is that, that this grieving is going to evoke a response that in faith people are going to live towards in hope. Um, I put Elijah here because we're going to be talking about Elijah in the Sunday school in the adult forum class next Sunday. But Elijah is kind of the paradigmatic uh, prophet who rails out against the system in the new Israel, in the 10 tribes, the country called Israel, the nation called Israel. Any thoughts about this idea of grief, crying out? That's one side of the coin. Go ahead, Danny. You were going to say something?
Oh, I'm just back to my social science 101 that um, seems to me Brueggemann in so many ways has done some really neat, fascinating insights, provided fascinating insights, but he also looks upon the structure of modern society as an aberration, as if there was a choice. And I haven't seen very many replications of New Harmony, Indiana, or the Israeli kibbutzim, which I think came about in desperation of survival of those who first arrived in Israel, with virtually nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure what the status of most kibbutzim is today in terms of their role in 1948, 49, 50, 51, after the Nakba. I'm just saying that there's a lot of social science that is being either ignored, shoved aside, or whatever.
Can you say a little bit more about New Harmony? I know what this is where Paul Tillich was buried, I
Yes.
believe. But tell us a little bit about New Harmony.
Oh, what little I know is almost from just happening to be in New Harmony on the way back to Hastings from the east, and just remembering from Theme in Italy back in college, um, studying about it. It was I think one of the first communes, if you will.
Right.
What, in 1805-ish, 1810,
I thought it was a little later than
a
that, but
little later.
I'm not an expert on this, so
No, I'm not either. Um, but the whole idea, and I can't remember who was the active promoter and organizer of New Harmony. Is somebody out there help me on that one? But Will?
go ahead, Will.
Well, Denny, I think that was a good summary. Ginny and I happened to be returning from a trip, I think, to Michigan, Upper Peninsula, Porcupine Mountains, and we drove through New Harmony or into it, but I couldn't explain very much of the history and leadership other than your summary, which
Mm.
sounds good to me. But and this is so terribly important, there is a New Harmony hybrid elm planted on the Hastings College campus.
Say more about that, Will. I mean, was it developed in New Harmony, Indiana, or is there just
Well,
what's the
I'm kind
connection?
of thinking that, and it's a hybrid, and so it has classic American elm, and then it has some other elm in it. Um, but that's all I can say.
Hmm. Yeah.
But it's called New Harmony, and I'm sure it's after, as Denny said, um, a commune, a kibbutzim, that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
This
It would be very, very conservative.
New Harmony and other models of community like this were the result of a movement that took place in New York, in upper state New York, and that area was known as the Burned Over District because their talk about fire and brimstone. I don't know what the connection with the Second Great Awakening was, but I presume there's probably some sort of connection there. But this would have been the movement and the geographical context that would have produced Joseph Smith at the same time in his golden tablets. So, Mac, I see you wanted to say something, I think.
The name of the guy who, well, it was founded by a group of Germans, and it was named New Harmony. And I think the founder that you'd find in most of your textbooks would be Robert Owen.
Robert Owen. What was the year, Mac? Do you remember? Or did you look it up?
1825.
1825.
Well, I've got 1814 by the Harmony Society, a group of German separatists.
Yeah.
And that's who he bought it from. That's who he bought it from. And gave it the name New Harmony.
And
Okay.
they were utopian.
Right.
communities.
Exactly.
Utopian.
Okay.
And if you remember what was happening in Germany at that time, of the high militarism of especially all of the wars that were happening, you can imagine that that they wanted to create a community that was as far removed from that as possible. This is not my area of expertise, so I hesitate to say anything more about that, other than to say that one of my favorite theologians, Paul Tillich, chose to be buried in New Harmony. I'd like to know more about that before I leave this planet. The other side of prophetic criticizing, which happens in crying out, also brings the element of hope. And this is what I appreciate so much about what Greg says every Sunday. And he introduces our worship service that First Presbyterian Church is a community of hope, and you will always hear a message of hope proclaimed. This is the last word of the prophet. This is the word that many of the prophet-like people in the 70s that Brueggemann's talking about left out. The progressive prophets in the 70s and 80s, they left out the hope element, right? But this criticizing is nothing unless it is energized and energizes people with a promise. And that promise usually draws on a story from the past that's foundational. This is kind of complicated because, I wonder what the story was that Brueggemann's talking about among the Hebrews, because if we acknowledge that the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were stories that were written later, right? What stories were energizing the people? What were they drawing on, right? Well, maybe they were oral traditions that did feature people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But there was at least some sort of energizing story in which they saw themselves as characters, as primary characters, as protagonists, right? That there was a promise that was going to be fulfilled. And to accentuate that promise all the more, you criticize and bring to light the fact that things are not the way they are supposed to be. And the last thing we want to do is get co-opted into empire. And that's where you kind of fall into this lethargy, this despair that nothing new happens on the face of the earth. It's kind of interesting because this is essentially what we hear in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Reputedly written by King Solomon. And it, I've never heard anybody make this argument, but given what Brueggemann says, that King Solomon, as a representative of empire and of the status quo, was probably co-opted by the triumphalism and nothing newness of his own monarchy. And so it makes sense that Ecclesiastes would be written out of that context. But the energizing that takes place has three dimensions, says Brueggemann. First of all, it is the need to, and this really maintains a foot into the criticizing, right? To embrace the darkness that, that the sun will rise, and the sun will come out tomorrow, right? But in the midst of this darkness, God is still working. And Brueggemann talks about, the hardness of heart of Pharaoh. God is working on both sides of the street, so to speak. And there will be a time of despair, but in that despair, hold fast to the promise. Embrace the darkness, knowing that God is present there just as much as God is present in the promise and the light. The other one, and here's where I wanted to make a point, I mentioned this last week, is that God is a preferential God. God is on the side of the people. Here's where I think I want to be very careful on how I say this. But in the 21st century, there is the sense that Israel is an elect nation, that God has favor over Israel. And, you can look back on this story and almost justify that attitude based on what we're talking about here, right? There's not going to be a dog that will, bark against Israel, as they says in Exodus 11:7. But is it Israel as a nation? They're not a nation now. What they are, what characterizes them in Egypt, is that they are poor, they are slaves, they are despairing, they are, the worst that humans can experience, they are experiencing. They are nothing in the eyes of the empire. And it's those people that God has a preference for. It's not the nation of Israel. So, on the right, we often hear about God chose Israel as his, his people. No, God chose poor slaves. God chose people crying out in anguish. And it's those people that God has a preference for. As Gustavo Gutierrez said, is a preferential option for the poor. These are God's people, not some conceptualized abstract notion of a nation state that would exist 3,000 years hence. It doesn't matter who the people are, where they live in a nation, but God's preference is for those who cry out, and he is going to create a new hope for justice in which justice can prevail and where compassion can also prevail. And Brueggemann makes an interesting point. He says, this is a God we're not talking about a promise that has its foot in eternity. This promise has to deal with the issues here and now. No conceptualizing about this God who's got a grand scheme in mind. Oh, things will work out. God has a plan. No, God is there if you will, pardon the metaphor, I guess, that God is there at the bedside, at the hospital bedside, holding the hand of the victim. That is where God can be discerned. God can be discerned in the breaking points. Something is happening, something is breaking into history, and that's where God can be discerned, not in the prognostications or the reflections of the theologians. And then finally, this energizing must conclude in doxology. We all sing the doxology, praise God from whom all blessed. It's, glorifying God. But it's probably better to think of doxology as the idea of giving gratitude. of offering up gratitude in a way that takes complete control of who you are. You know, Brueggemann says something has got to be something that's experienced almost as a dance. And this is where the Song of Miriam, I wanted to take a little brief detour here to talk about the Song of Miriam, which is so important. Because if you read it in, I think it's Exodus 15, 1 through 22, it's the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. But scholars believe that this, it's a song, really. This verse is probably the oldest verse that we have in the Hebrew Bible. It is, if you read it in English, you will see when you come upon it, it's written in kind of poetic form. And in Hebrew, it has the kind of meter and that you can easily memorize, right? Scholars suggest that this song may have had its origin, its historical origin in the experience, this experience of liberation, whatever it was, right? Using poetic license to talk about, the soldiers of Pharaoh are sucked into the sea, and their swords have been lost, and we have been removed from our oppression. But the fact that it comes from Miriam, a woman, later it gets attributed to Moses and is called the Song of Moses. But there is this, this feminist critique that says this is an experience that was felt most profoundly in the heart of women. Remember, they were the ones that were losing their babies, who's the midwives were taking their babies and dashing their heads against the stones, right? But as so often happens, this story gets co-opted and attributed to Moses. Now, why is this so important? Because as we move into Advent and we read what's called the Magnificat of Mary, my soul magnifies the Lord, for he has heard my affliction, right? Let me read it if I can just find it very quickly. Hopefully you know the Magnificat, and I wasn't prepared for this. I'm just kind of winging it right now. But it is a praise song of doxology. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, for he has looked with favor upon his lowly servant. Surely from now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the mighty one has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to his descendants forever. That's about as doxological as you can get. And that is really a reshaping of this doxology that we find in Exodus. The Song of Miriam is the foundation and really alludes to, in its form, is the foundation of the Magnificat of Mary. Mary is in good Luke form, right? Remember, this is the Messiah who's going to be like, the covenant Messiah, establishing a community of egalitarianism. That strand. This harkens all the way back to the original experience of the Hebrews in Egypt. So, we will probably hear this at some point as Advent approaches. So that was my brief detour. Any comments about this doxology idea?
Dan,
Yeah.
it made me think of the praise services in contemporary congregations that kind of rely on that
Right.
as the kind of main point of the whole activity. And I remember going to a memorial service, actually a funeral service for a colleague's wife here in Hastings. And I remember sitting there thinking that her grandchildren were hearing praise for God, but not any reference to her and to the sadness they were feeling. The
Yeah.
service was so praise oriented that there was no kind of room for comfort.
Right.
And
Now,
I
how,
wondered if some of this doxology concept has gone, in one direction only.
well, it can in some of those evangelical services because the record skips to the last, to the end, right? This was Brueggemann's critique of the conservative movement at the time when he was writing, is that they're full of energizing, which includes doxology, but there's not much criticizing, right? And so the two of those have to go hand in hand. You must go through the dark night of the soul before getting to doxology, really. Doxology is meaningless. Praise music is meaningless unless you have identified what you are standing over against, right? And what God is standing over against. Unless you have identified the narrative that is not your narrative, then you can focus on the narrative that is yours and the promise inherent in that. And then finally, the doxology. But that's why this praise music is usually so vapid, because it just ends up being, well, as doxology ends up being ideology. Brueggemann says it himself. Without doxology, there's only ideology. And if there's only doxology, it ends up being ideology as well. Witness Christian nationalism. So on that point, I think I'm going to stop. Are there other questions or comments about this?
Dan,
Yeah,
I think it's important to remember that for the stories of doxology and the prophets and other important messages,
Mhm.
that had to be carried for 99% of human population
Right.
by oral tradition and oratory, because this is pre-literate, the pre-literate world until what, 1900?
Right.
In the introduction of public schools in 1920s, I believe.
Yeah.
Will, is that John
That's about
Dewey and John Dewey and the rise of public education is
as a right instead of a privilege.
exactly.
Yeah.
And we wonder where the air quotes Trump base comes from. And seriously, it is out
Yeah.
of, having to make up, and make sense of the world through oral tradition
Mhm.
and pass that along to your children and family members and for thousands of years.
And the structure of oral tradition is in song as well as dance. I mean, this is what we often have referred to as primal rituals or primitive rituals, right? What you're saying is absolutely true. I mean, we use our bodies in those kinds of rituals where singing takes place and you are actually responding to the singing in ritualized ways. There's a kinesthetic memory that is established in doing something like that. Now we tend to be very, very cerebral in all of this, but Brueggemann does talk about the importance of the liberation of the body because it was it was bodies in Egypt that were being liberated, not so much, souls as well. There was a new reality that was breaking into history in this. And we'll have to wait for that till next time and talk about the name of God as well. Go ahead, Will.
Well, I just wanted to thank Denny for bringing up the name of my hero, John Dewey, University of Chicago, and uh, he pushed experiential
Right.
education. So how do you teach? The Oregon Trail, you walk in the ruts, and you can teach through planting trees.
Yeah. And I want to say this is one thing that I've really appreciated about Rose Kep, is that when she does a children's sermon, she introduces bodily or kinesthetic aspects
Yeah.
to the teaching itself. And that has staying power with, especially with young kids. So next time she does a children's sermon, I've rarely seen one where she does not do this. We do the worst thing when we just talk at kids, right? Expecting them in their developmental stage to understand our conceptual thinking. Um, but anyway, we've reached our time, and I'm going to stop our share here. And when we
Dan,
come back, we are going to get to chapter 2. Go ahead, Danny. You
one,
question?
one quickie. I'm reading a really fascinating piece on Patrick Henry as we come to the 250th. And Patrick Henry was maybe the greatest orator of all of his, certainly of his time. He
Yeah,
never wrote anything, he has no written record of things that he wrote, but Lordy, because of oral tradition, because he was from the outback, if you will, of the Tidewater, he was able to convince the the pre-literates in America that this was a cause and a battle worth doing.
right.
And he was shunned in many ways by the founding fathers who considered themselves, bigger than him, except for Thomas Jefferson.
Right, right. Yeah, this is very important, and I'd love to talk more about. We see a lot of the cadence and the meter of the oral tradition in the African American church, and the type of preaching that we see there, because in order to remember these things over a long period of time, you have to have some sort of mechanism that is going to keep it fresh. Um, anyway, thank you, everybody. What a great conversation this was. Yeah.
Indeed.
Um, let's meet again next time in chapter 2. I'm going to finish up chapter 1, and then chapter 2 will be our focus. That's what we'll be moving into the discussion of King Solomon and the changes that he wrought. Uh, and, and that's WR, not ROT. Okay. The changes that he effected in Israel in the 10th century. So I'll see you later. I'm going to say goodbye. See you. Thanks.